In November 1993, the disappearance of 9-year-old Angie Hausman gripped the St. Louis community. Angie stepped off her school bus on a quiet suburban street just a few doors away from her home, and then vanished without a trace. Her family and neighbors launched a desperate search as fear spread through the neighborhood, with hundreds of volunteers and police scouring the area for any sign of the missing girl. For 9 agonizing days, loved ones and law enforcement held out hope. But when a deer hunter finally stumbled upon Angie's body bound to a tree in a remote wildlife preserve, the community's worst nightmare became reality. The case would remain one of the region's most haunting cold cases for over 25 years, until a tiny piece of DNA evidence finally brought the perpetrator to justice. On Thursday, November 18, 1993, Angie Hausman stepped off her school bus at about 4 p.m. in St. Anne, Missouri. She was only 9 years old, walking the short distance to her house on a seemingly ordinary afternoon. But somewhere between the bus stop and her front door, less than a block away, in broad daylight, Angie vanished. That evening, when she still hadn't arrived home, her worried mother and stepfather contacted the police at around 7 that evening, reporting Angie as missing. What began as a frantic search by family quickly escalated into a massive police operation. Within days, the major case squad of Greater St. Louis was activated to assist the St. Anne police in the investigation. As hours turned into days with no sign of Angie, the community's concern turned to panic. Dozens of law enforcement officers and volunteers combed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, and scoured nearby parks and backyards. Despite these efforts, there were no witnesses, no clues, and no answers. 9 days after Angie disappeared, the search came to a tragic end. On November 27, 1993, a deer hunter exploring the Bush Wildlife Conservation Area in St. Charles County stumbled upon a horrifying scene. He found Angie's lifeless body in the woods, tied tightly to a tree and partially covered by snow in the cold, late November air. I'm going to spare you most of the details here because they're horrific, but she was subjected to an indecent assault, and biological evidence was left behind by the predator. And seriously, when I say don't look up the details here, I'm not joking. I wish I could unread what I read. In the months and years after Angie's slaying, investigators struggled to find the perpetrator and bring him to justice. The crime had been so brazen and cruel that many feared it could happen again. In fact, just a few weeks after Angie's death, another local girl was abducted and slain, sparking fears of a serial predator on the loose. However, this case was quickly wrapped up and the perpetrator was definitively proven not to have been involved in Angie's case. By the late 1990s, the trail had gone cold, and Angie's case haunted detectives for decades, remaining officially open, but with no meaningful developments. Meanwhile, Angie's family and the community kept her memory alive. Sadly, her mother, Diane, lived the rest of her life in grief, passing away in 2016 without ever seeing justice for her daughter. In 2019, more than a quarter century after Angie's tragic passing, the long-awaited breakthrough finally came. On February 27, 2019, a senior forensic scientist at the St. Charles County Crime Lab made a stunning discovery. There was previously undetected DNA on the torn remnants of Angie's undergarments. Advanced testing had lifted a genetic profile that investigators in the 1990s could never have obtained with the forensic science of the time. The DNA belonged to 2 individuals. One was Angie herself, and the other was an unknown male profile now identified through the National CODIS database. The match pointed to a man who was, thankfully, already behind bars. His name was Earl Webster Cox, a 61-year-old convicted predator who had grown up in the St. Louis area. At the time of Angie's abduction, Cox had been living just a few blocks away from her home in St. Anne. He was a former Air Force airman who had been dishonorably discharged in the 1980s for committing disturbing and unnatural acts against minors. By 2019, he was in federal custody at a medical facility in North Carolina, serving time due to his role in an international ring producing this disgusting content. Investigators, in shock at the DNA results, collected a fresh DNA sample from Cox to double-check the match. It confirmed that Cox's genetic fingerprint was on Angie's clothing, a probability of coincidence so low that it was virtually impossible anyone else could be responsible. After 26 years of mystery, prosecutors finally had their suspect. In June 2019, St. Charles County Prosecutor Tim Lomar announced charges in relation to the slaying of Angie Hausman. There was also a lingering possibility that Cox hadn't acted alone. Investigators hinted that someone else might have been involved, but to date, no other accomplice has been publicly identified or charged. Facing the mountain of evidence against him, Earl Cox eventually chose to admit his guilt rather than go to trial. In August 2020, he pleaded guilty to first-degree slaying in Angie's case on the condition that he would avoid the state-sponsored DP. Personally, with the level of evidence against him, I don't see why they didn't just go full bore and seek the DP, but given his age and health, it's unlikely that it ever would have been done. And I say this for a specific strategic purpose, since, as you'll recall, there was a mention of someone else potentially being involved. Facing down a trial where his life was legitimately on the line may have forced him to name the name of his potential accomplice, if one existed. But all that said, no case is a slam dunk, so perhaps simply ensuring this sick excuse for a human being would never be on the streets again no matter what was good enough. After all, had the prosecution missed their one shot, it's theoretically possible that he would have one day become a free man once again. A judge sentenced the 63-year-old Cox to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Hausman family and the investigators who had pursued the truth for so long, it was a moment of both relief and sorrow. In late 2024, while serving his life sentence, the 66-year-old Cox died of natural causes in a Missouri prison hospital, a fate which was all too good for him. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here with my usual reminder for you to hit like and subscribe, and also tap that notification bell. Also, don't forget to suggest solved cold cases you'd like to see covered on my channel in the comments. They can be anything from extremely well-known cases to local cases that have never gotten any attention outside of your own neck of the woods. On a chilly autumn morning in 1994, 18-year-old Bonnie Craig set out for an early morning college English class in Anchorage, Alaska. She never arrived, and by afternoon, a hiker discovered a young woman's body face down in the waters of McHugh Creek, a rugged area about 10 miles south of the city. It was Bonnie, and she had been subjected to an indecent assault, viciously beaten, and left for dead in that frigid creek. This slaying rattled Anchorage, and outraged residents wouldn't forget the young woman whose life was stolen in such a senseless and evil manner. This gruesome discovery shocked the community and launched an investigation that would span nearly 2 decades. From the start, detectives faced a perplexing scene. Because Bonnie's body was found in a remote creek and showed signs of drowning, authorities initially considered the possibility of an accidental fall. However, evidence of foul play quickly emerged. Bonnie's school belongings were missing. Her hands bore bruises and cuts consistent with defensive wounds, and an indecent assault examination found biological evidence. This quickly dispelled that initial theory that her passing was an accident. Investigators pieced together Bonnie's final known movements. As a University of Alaska freshman, She usually walked through the pre-dawn dark to catch a bus to her early class. On September 28, 1994, a driver saw her heading toward the bus stop at around 5:20, but she never made it onto the bus. Sometime during that short walk, she vanished, and no one witnessed the attack or abduction itself. Neighbors later reported a suspicious vehicle in the area, and an anonymous caller claimed Bonnie was seen talking to two men in a car at the bus stop, but these leads went nowhere. Whoever had attacked her left few traces beyond the DNA evidence, which, with the forensic technology of the time, wasn't quite as powerful a piece of evidence as it is today. Clues from the scene painted a grim picture of what happened. It appeared Bonnie had been overpowered and then thrown from a 30-foot cliff into the creek, likely in an attempt to hide the brutal crime. The autopsy found a dozen wounds on her head, including a severe blow at the base of her skull that couldn't have come from the fall down the slope. In fact, some of her blood was discovered on the leaves at the top of the embankment, indicating she was already bleeding profusely before her body landed in the water below. Despite an intensive investigation, the trail to Bonnie's attacker soon grew cold. Police conducted hundreds of interviews and ran down countless tips. Bonnie's face became familiar on posters and the sides of city buses as her family and authorities pleaded for information, emphasizing that even the smallest tip could crack the case open. The attack was one of the most notorious cases Anchorage had ever seen, yet no viable suspect emerged. Investigators looked at several individuals, but DNA and alibis ruled them all out. The answer finally came from a leap in forensic science. All the while, the unknown assailant's DNA profile from the crime scene sat waiting for a match. In late 2006, more than 12 years after Bonnie's slaying, that profile hit a match in the national database. A routine DNA sample taken from an incarcerated felon on the East Coast matched the DNA from Bonnie's case, and the cold case had cracked open at last. The DNA belonged to 36-year-old Kenneth Dion, a former Army paratrooper who had lived in Alaska in the early 1990s. At the time of the hit, Dion was serving a prison sentence in New Hampshire for robbery. He had indeed been in Anchorage around 1994. In fact, he was on probation after a prior robbery conviction and had been released from an Alaska prison just months before Bonnie's death. Yet Dion had never been on investigators' radar until this moment, and the forensic match was virtually certain. After years of mystery, science had finally revealed the perpetrator's identity. Dion was indicted for Bonnie's slaying in 2007 and extradited back to Alaska to face charges. Nearly 17 years after Bonnie's death, Kenneth Dion went on trial in Anchorage in May 2011. Bonnie's smiling portrait was shown to the jury as prosecutors retold the story of her long unsolved death. Prosecutors then presented a powerful case built on compelling forensic evidence. The autopsy showed that Bonnie's wounds came from a violent beating, not an accident, and the blood found atop the cliff further disproved any notion that her fall was unintentional. Investigators described how Dion, then 25 years old at the time of the crime, likely spotted Bonnie on her early morning walk and abducted her. He then drove her out to the secluded creek to carry out his horrific acts. Dion's defense team did not dispute that his DNA was present, but they offered an alternate explanation for the events that's basically guaranteed to piss everyone off. They claimed that Dion and Bonnie had a consensual encounter early that morning, and that she later slipped and fell from the cliff to her death by accident. This theory, however, was undermined by the physical evidence and by Bonnie's own character. She had been in love with her long-distance boyfriend at the time, and wasn't the kind of person to engage in a reckless interaction with a stranger early in the morning on the way to class. Dion perhaps hadn't hired a star defense team to represent him either, because his own statements to the cops after he was brought in undermined their theory of the case. When first questioned by police after the DNA match, Dion had claimed he'd never even met Bonnie, undermining this trash-tier theory crafted by his defense. Moreover, the extensive injuries and signs of struggle made the accident story impossible to believe. After a 3-week trial full of emotional testimony, the jury rejected the defense's version of events. In June 2011, they found Kenneth Dion guilty on all charges, and that October, a judge sentenced him to 124 years in prison. At the sentencing, authorities noted that Dion's prior violent offenses and probation violations meant he should never have been free in 1994. This was a bitter reminder that Bonnie's slaying would have been prevented had he been properly jailed earlier. Spurred by this case, Alaska lawmakers in 2007 passed what became known as the Bonnie Craig Law, requiring DNA to be collected at the time of all felony arrests. In the years since, many other states have followed suit by implementing similar DNA on arrest laws so that violent offenders are identified sooner. The logic was simple. If such a policy had existed earlier, Dion's DNA from his prior arrests would have been on file, and the match could have caught him much sooner. The defense strategy in Bonnie Craig's case stands out as one of the most unsettling aspects of the entire case, aside from the crime itself. The claim that Bonnie had willingly engaged in a consensual encounter was both cruel and didn't even potentially match the evidence. The physical evidence, from her extensive defensive injuries to the blood found at the cliff's edge, painted a reality of the terror she was forced to endure in her last moments. To suggest otherwise forced her loved ones to relive the horror while hearing her memory distorted in court. It reduced Bonnie to a narrative that contradicted both her character and the clear facts of the case, and simply put, the defense raised didn't have the air of reality. For her family, sitting through such testimony must have been excruciating. Rather than simply attempting to prove he wasn't guilty, these defense lawyers dragged the family through yet another layer of trauma for no reason whatsoever. And before you comment, I do fully understand that the duty of defense counsel is to raise all possible defenses for their client. But what they raised here in this instance wasn't even theoretically possible on the basis of the evidence, and they had no evidence to prove it wasn't.